Hey, what's happening, folks? This is the Negro Subversive Podcast, episode 2 on Black Separatism. In our last episode, we looked at whether or not it would be possible to remain in the United States if we moved to a section of states to establish a majority, or if we would need to create our own separate territory outside the United States. At the end, I alluded to the fact that it would be impossible to think the way we need to think to get where we need to go without substantially broadening our horizons and throwing overboard some basic assumptions about what progress looks like and about how we've made progress in the past. In the next 2 episodes, we're going to look at Integrationist-Assimilationism, which I referenced last time. We're going to look at it in greater depth and how it constrains our thinking and gives us a partial narrative of how we have made progress historically, and the different directions of progress available to us. As I said in the last episode, back in 2018, I wrote an article called Why I'm a Black Separatist, or Why I Am a Black Separatist, in which I laid out 14 theses of what I called Integrationist-Assimilationism. The article is still up at negrosubversive.com for anybody who wants to review the entire thing. In that article, I sketch a brief outline of a history of autonomous black thinking in order to highlight certain areas that are not typically part of the traditional progress narrative. It is not nearly exhaustive, and in the future I want to expand on it, because one of the ways that theories of history become entrenched is through selective presentation. I don't want to get too deep into the discussion of theories of history, because that can also definitely be its own episode and maybe in the future. But put simply, every brand of politics has its own theory of history, because ultimately, if you're arguing about what we should do now, you're expressing your position on where we are currently. And if you're expressing a position on where we are currently, that requires a certain interpretation of how we got there. So that's why so much of the political debate is about history. It's about the past. Because if you can control how and what people think about the past, you can control how and what they think about the present and the future. And as Africans in America, our ability to think through our present and future is severely handicapped by the ideology of Integrationist-Assimilationism. It tells us how to think about our past, and it does this by leaving out anything that is inconvenient to the ideology itself. Any evidence that Africans in America seriously moved or considered moving in other directions is left out. It does this by leaving out anything that is inconvenient to itself and leaving out any evidence that black folks seriously considered moving in other directions, which then restricts our thinking about what we can seek in the present, which then narrows our potential paths into the future. It does this by narrowly and inaccurately presenting the past. And by narrowly and inaccurately presenting the past, you narrow a people's horizon for the present and the future. That's why I think it's important to make integrationist assimilationism explicit, because ideologies and theories of history are at their most powerful when you don't even know that your thinking is based on them. You'll think you're thinking freely and critically. You'll think you're having your own thoughts. But what you think are your own thoughts are heavily restrained by borders and boundaries that you can't even see. Making these borders and boundaries explicit is the purpose of the 14 theses in the essay. I'm not going to go through all of them. Some of them are very similar because they're just different ways of articulating the same basic assumption, which is useful because you can approach the same assumption and intellectual framework from slightly different directions. And because I really want to get down to the basic foundation of the way we think about and make assumptions about history. Thesis number 1 is that the highest level of personal prestige which can be gained by an individual member of the community reflects our collective status as a community. I might call this one the first black president thesis. It's easy to assume that the reason folks were excited about the idea of the first black president was that they thought he would actually do things for the community. But we see how quickly folks leaned into the he can't show favoritism because he's the president of all America, that type of rhetoric. I would argue that's because most people did not actually expect that a black president would be able to work for us individually as a people. But the basic assumption was that a country that could elect a black president must have gotten past its racism. People were so irrationally convinced of this that folks started talking about post-racism and post-blackness. It was a profoundly disturbing moment, and I bet you if you ask most people who were spewing this garbage, they'll deny it. But of course, nobody talks about it anymore because no matter how fast you run, reality always runs faster. And it's not because things were developing differently back then. The indicators were there. Some folks were just so brain-addled by the integrationist-assimilationist conditioning that they decided to stop seeing what was right in front of them. Thesis 2. The ability of whites, individually or collectively, to interact with black people in professional or social settings is a direct reflection of the extent to which they harbor racist indoctrination. This thesis is the flip side to integrationism, particularly in schools, which civil rights era activists only really discussed when they were being more idealistic and talking about what the movement for school integration would mean in their minds for the broader society. It was the idea that if you got people all together into the same spaces, that would begin to wear down the walls of prejudice. It's this idea that interaction over long periods of time undermines prejudice. Now, the last 67 years should have rendered that idea obsolete, or more to the point, incorrect. Even though there is still substantial school integration, there's no real evidence that even though there's still substantial practical school segregation, there's no real evidence that school integration has had any significant impact on society. And the fact of continuing de facto school segregation shows the extent to which the white majority will go to avoid this kind of true integration, even if it would work. Even if it would work, you can't make that happen in a fundamentally hostile society. But the last 67 years should have rendered that idea obsolete or incorrect. But because it is rarely said out loud, it's hard for it to become truly obsolete. This is again part of the power of unstated, unexamined ideologies. You can't even notice that reality keeps proving your idea wrong if you don't know you have the idea, if you just use it to frame your thinking out of a habit. You don't really hear folks anymore talking about how racism is allegedly going to die out with the upcoming generations. There are too many college-age and high school Nazis running around promoting white supremacy. Too many people are being radicalized on YouTube and social media to make the argument that racism is ever going to just die out because it's a lucrative endeavor. It's lucrative. It makes money. It's materially beneficial. It would be, from the pure standpoint of group profit, an actual miscalculation to just let racism die out. The next step from recognizing this is to ask, if we can't defeat it in the maternity ward, if you can't expect people to just naturally stop being white supremacists because they're no longer completely segregated, what do you do next? Another aspect of this idea of integrationist, or the idea behind this particular thesis, fails to recognize is the way that institutions function. What segregated schools and integrated schools had in common is that whites controlled them. Even if you had black teachers or even a black principal, the superintendent was white. Even if you had a black superintendent, and I don't know how often that happened, even in predominantly black areas, probably almost never, they were under the control of the state. This idea that if you throw a bunch of people in a bag together, they'll somehow jumble together and that will end racism and that will cause real harmony. This assumption ignores that if whites control an institution, they can set the terms of interaction. Anybody who's ever existed in a corporate context knows that this is obvious. And so you're forced to tolerate white supremacist behavior as long as it stays within certain bounds, as long as it doesn't become a legit federal civil rights case or violation. You just have to put up with it. And even if you could take it and turn it into a case, the issues of careerism, the fear of retribution, keeps people from pursuing the rights they actually have. So what it ends up happening is these now integrated white-controlled institutions, whether we're talking about public schools, colleges, or workplaces, mold us into the subjugated positions that the continuation of white supremacy demands of us. And if we refuse to be molded, either our ambitions are checked or they spit us out. Thesis 3. The degree to which whites consciously think black Africans are inferior is directly reflected in their willingness to support the policies which are necessary to secure racial equality. This thesis relates to a basic misunderstanding of how race and racism work. This is essentially an account of white liberal racism, where you have people who actively, officially, externally think that a group of people are equal without thinking that solving that group's severe problems are a priority for society. This is not at the front of their thinking. If pressed on it, they acknowledge it's an issue, but it's not the front of their thinking. It doesn't condition their politics in any meaningful way. And to be honest, you can't even tell how consciously or unconsciously these people think black Africans are inferior. That's why, essentially, from the foundation, any project that depends on figuring out how racist or not racist whites are is a bad plan from the beginning, at the root, because trying to unpack even a single individual's internal racist and racial dynamic is going to be difficult and, if not impossible. So trying to do so for millions of people and premising your plan for the liberation of a nation of people on that is absurd and, frankly, borderline idiotic. Thesis 4. In order for black Africans to get access to spaces and institutions, whites must experience a corresponding reduction in their collective racism, which means that if a person of black African descent gains access to a particular space, it must be because whites have experienced a corresponding and proportional reduction in their racism. This reflects this thesis. The thinking behind this thesis reflects an incredibly simplistic view of how institutions function. Barack Obama and the presidency again present a great example. There are many reasons that a black man was able to be elected to the presidency that had very little to do with any reduction in white America's racism. Now, just to be clear, I'm not saying that a reduction in the social acceptability of outright, official, explicit racism didn't make his election more possible at that moment than it would have been in the past. I'm also not saying that the mainstream norm of seeing racism as a bad thing didn't have something to do with it. I am saying that the effects of these social changes, this change in the social acceptability of racism, the effect that this had has been massively overstated. There is a gigantic gap between the mainstream official norms that are represented in the media and what's going on in the heads of most Americans. There is also a gigantic gap between the norms that are enforced in corporate spaces and in business spaces and in business context. There's a gap between that and what people believe in the privacy of their minds and their homes and on their own time. That said, these mainstream norms that elites impose through media and anti-discrimination laws do have an impact on the masses. We just should not assume that there's a one-to-one match between them. Just because you're not allowed to do certain things in the media, you're not allowed to do certain things on the job, to express certain beliefs on the job, to express certain beliefs in academia, wherever you are, just because you're not allowed to do certain things, to believe certain things with your public face does not mean that you still don't believe them with your private face. Plus, these institutions are still pretty racist. A lot of racism still gets excused in these spaces. A lot of racism is still present in the American media. So there's an estimation of how non-racist, on how an official norm against anti-racism gets expressed in institutions and in the media, because the media itself is still pretty racist. A lot of racist, anti-black conditioning still gets promoted through the media. So there's an overestimation of how non-racist the public face is, and there's also an underestimation of how much of a gap there is between the public face and the private face, what's going on in people's minds. And so, as you might have figured out, this is all incredibly complex. And so just making the assumption that, okay, look, there was a black president, there was a black XYZ, that means racism has been reduced, is flawed. That's what should be taken away from this. It's incredibly complex. You can't really see how they go together. And since you can't really see how they go together, you shouldn't be making simplistic assumptions, and we should not be hinging our liberation, freedom, prosperity, hope, and dignity of as a people on this incredibly complex thing called the racist American psyche. Even specifically with Obama, there was this phenomenon of the Obama Trump voter, the Obama to Trump voter, the white American who voted for Obama and then voted for Trump. I have not seen where that has been adequately addressed, described, or explained. My personal thesis is that the Obama Trump voters were whites who thought that Obama was supposed to be a final signpost on the road away from having to deal with racism and discuss it as a social issue. So in a lot of ways, they believe the same thing that a lot of us did, which is that if this country could elect a black president, this country must have gotten to a new plateau in terms of not getting racist, by not being racist. But they believed it. We believed it because we wanted, many of us believed it because we wanted better lives. They believed it because they wanted us to shut up. They believed it because they were tired of having to hear about this issue, and they thought that Obama represented an escape. And so again, the farther you go down this rabbit hole, the more complex it becomes, and the issue isn't to figure out what the proper thesis for integrationist-assimilationism is. It's to recognize that trying to tie your liberation to this country's incredibly complex and mutating racial psyche is a fool's errand and an idiot's game, and recognizing that we and our descendants and their descendants and their descendants have something better to do than to play that idiotic game. But that was thesis 4. Now, thesis 5. Thesis 5 states, the ability of blacks and whites to form social connections with each other, and I could also add in other groups of people, non-black groups of people that have anti-black conditioning, but I say blacks and whites because whites are still the majority, and I think that any adjustments this country makes in the next 100 or so years are going to be in order to preserve white supremacy. But yeah, the ability of blacks and whites to form social connections with each other reflects the ability of whites collectively to see blacks collectively as human. Therefore, the more blacks and whites interact, the more favorably whites will view black liberation. Now, this thesis is related to theses 2 and 3. Because we've been conditioned to assume that the ability to view us as fully human is a precondition for social interaction with us, and because you think that this correlates with how favorably whites view black liberation, you use that as a metric for how close we are to black liberation. Part of the problem is that being viewed as human does not necessarily mean the person viewing you is free of white supremacist conditioning. Here's an obvious example. Humans can befriend dogs, despite not thinking that dogs are the equals of human beings. So there's no reason to assume that the basic fact of social connection requires an absolute belief in equality. Here's an example that's closer to home. If you study slavery, you realize the complexity of the relationships that existed between slaveholders and the people they enslaved. Now, it was complex on the white side because whites always controlled them. If you look at a portrait of a white slaveholding family, you will often see an enslaved person in the photo. Now, I don't think people immediately grasp the significance of this because we're so used to pictures, to photographs. I might have said photographs, so I'm talking about painted portraits, by the way. But we're so used to photographs where somebody can just walk into the photo at the last minute and they'll get captured and they'll be in the picture. If somebody was in your painted portrait, you had to deliberately put them there because they had to sit there for hours, or the person making the portrait had to deliberately sketch them and then paint them later, whatever. Either way, it was deliberate. There's a famous portrait of George Washington and his family, and in the portrait there is an enslaved man named William Lee. William Lee. There's also a picture of Washington on his horse, and he's there with his. In that same photo is the man William Lee. He was Washington's personal attendant, his valet. He was there with Washington all the time. He helped Washington get dressed in the morning, took care of his horses. Wherever you saw George Washington, you saw this man. They were reported to have what seemed to be something like a friendship, and clearly, if Washington saw this person as a part of himself so much that he had him in pictures with him, he clearly saw this as an important, meaningful person. It was very common for white enslavers to give to their young children enslaved black children who would be their personal servants and follow them throughout life. When the white child went to college, the black enslaved child went with them, and they would sleep on it. And if there was no place else to sleep, they'd sleep on the floor. And so you would have had these two people be together from early life until later life. And if you observe the way they interacted, you might have seen almost something that resembled a human friendship. Now, of course, it was human friendship in the context of a social system that subjugated one and elevated the other. So if there was a falling out between them, guess who was going to get sent out to the field? So it could never have been genuine and real. Though you'll find really weird things in the archive. I read about a situation recently, and again, now again, whenever you read about these accounts, they're always written by whites, and so there's their interpretation. But it described this enslaved man and his so-called owner who would get into actual arguments, and they would get into arguments about the enslaved man drinking too much, and they would just go back and forth. Maybe that's true, maybe it's not. It's quite possible, but it does not change the reality of the system. And no matter what kind of dynamic you had, it never turned the white into an abolitionist. I shouldn't say it never did. It almost never did. Because these kinds of interactions were common. Maybe not with arguing back and forth, but you would have had time to form decades-long human connections with other people, with these people you were holding in bondage. You would have known them, and they would have known you way better than any person today, generally, knows somebody who they're interacting with across the color line, and it's still... You had every opportunity to observe this person at their best, at their worst. Not just this person, the community around them. You were as familiar with black Africans as anybody could be, and it did not turn these people into abolitionists. And I would suspect they still saw these people as inferior. This idea that you can only see somebody as being inferior to you from across the railroad tracks, that only from looking at them from a distance and hearing what you've been told about them. No, you can spend massive amounts of time around people and still think they're inferior. Even if you don't think they're inferior, you just don't care. You know they're not inferior. You know they're as human as you are, but you do not want to. You don't have any plans of picking your own tobacco. You don't have any plans of picking your own cotton. You have no plans of bringing yourself your morning brandy or whatever. You have no one. As Lincoln put it very well, if the two races are going to live together and one race must be on top, I prefer it be the white race. Lincoln said, the race to which I belonged. So the assumption, again, is faulty, it's complex, it's very based on individual dynamics, but ultimately you can abstract from individual dynamics to the system. Is this, and ask yourself, is this desegregation, is it working? And one of the reasons it's not working, let's say for the sake of argument that if there really were consistent, deep social connections, that would really adjust the racial conditioning of whites. As is the case that I believe I alluded to with school segregation, even if this would work, whites actively resist it. They seek communities where we are not. They deliberately, they feel more comfortable and prefer white environments. And if the environments can't be exclusively white because of what looks good in public relations, they try to keep them as white as possible. They lead with what is most comfortable for them, and what's most comfortable for them is an all-white environment. And if it can't be an all-white environment, it needs to be an environment where whites are in control. That's not conducive to the kind of sincere exchange that would theoretically maybe get rid of their conditioning. There's been research about how uncommon it is for white Americans to have friends who are not white. Again, they facilitate this by moving to increasingly segregated communities, keeping their workplaces as segregated as possible, etc., etc., etc. So even if it would work, whites don't want it. So that would seem to me to be an indicator that we should let it go. Instead of saying, oh, let's come up with more elaborate ways to build friendships across the color line. They don't want it. I don't particularly want them. And maybe this is, and I'll talk a little bit about this more when I get to the Blow book in a couple of episodes. This might be the black southerner in me. We live in cities where we've been small southern towns of the same families interacting for 300 years. The whites stay right the hell over there, and we stay over on our side, and that's the way it ought to be, and it's fine. Now, if somebody wants to cross that line, if you want to have friendships across the line, that's your business. But we're not sitting on our side of the railroad tracks thinking, well, I wish the whites would come over here, and I wish we could go over there. And you can travel where you want, but there's not the assumption that there needs to be some kind of melding together for our liberation, and that's just the only way that we can have justice as a people is flawed. And we need to start thinking, if they want to be over there, they can be over there. We need to be over here, but we need to have control of over here. The problem isn't segregation, that they're over there and we're over here. The problem is that they're over there and they control over there and they control over here. That's why most of the most blatant, brutal systems of systems of white supremacy under Jim Crow were in the Black Belt. They were in predominantly black areas of the South, because whites had to make sure that they kept political control so they could keep economic control. They didn't, they wanted to be segregated from us as humans, but not from our labor, and not from the land under our feet in areas where we predominated. So that dynamic, again, and that's an important dynamic to keep in mind. Segregation is not the problem. Separation is not the problem. It's when the power is over there and we're over here, and the power that controls our life is over there. That went a little longer than I intended. Either way, this has been episode 2 of the Negro Subversive Podcast. Episode 3 is already up. Thanks for listening. This has again been the Negro Subversive Podcast. Signing off. Wait. Hold up. I want to add an addendum. Near the end of this episode, in discussing the relations, the interactions between people of African descent and people of Anglo-Saxon descent in the American Southeast, I said that they stay over there and we stay over here, and that is the way it ought to be. I wish to be clear so that I am not mistaken. Under normal conditions, there's nothing about people having different skin colors or complexions or otherwise looking different that should get in the way of them being able to interact reasonably. But these are not normal conditions. This is not a normal situation. This is the United States of America, and this is the American South. Nothing normal about it. It's been a fundamentally pathological situation from the beginning. Now, the reason I think it's important to make this very clear, to make sure that I'm not in the camp of people who argue that diversity itself is the problem, which is what some Nazis and other racists try to do. They say, oh, it's just diversity. You can't get two groups and put them together. Number one, that ignores white agency, that ignores the decisions that whites have taken, and that ignores the ways that white supremacy is a tool and a strategy of power. Oh, you just can't put two people together. And of course, the subtext of that is the idea that we're inferior. But essentially, it's not the diversity. Because you have, it's what meaning you assign to the diversity. As we know, in many places, people fight massive wars over religion. In fact, it's much more common to fight massive wars over religion, or to have social disorder over religion, than it is to have multiple religions, or even multiple denominations getting along. The United States has been really quite good historically at not having fights over religion. And that's because the relevant dividing line for most people is race. And so whites are united across religious lines, and so they don't fight. They're united as whites across religious lines, so they don't fight over religion. So it's about what you can have all the diversity you want, but as long as people in a single state basically see everybody else there as human and they're able to interact normally, and you don't have systematic exploitation and subjugation, you can have all the diversity you want. That's not what causes it. What causes it is when one group wants to keep power over other groups, and another group does not want to let the group that has power over them keep power over them. It always boils down to power. Now that that's clear, signing off actually. This has been, again, the Negro Subversive Podcast. Again, episode 3 is already up. Go listen to it. Signing off.